But I would like to make my words of welcome too. We started planning all of this in Reverend O'Grady's backyard in June sometime, looking at what in the world we could do, thinking it through, brainstorming, and we came up somehow with an invitation that Mark and I would open it up tonight and launch the whole series. But as you know, and as Jen was just saying, there's a lot to come through this fall season. I want to say a word of thanks, though, to a few people, to Reverend O'Grady for sure, for giving guidance, for standing up each Sunday and promoting the whole program. We're just very, very grateful for that, and as well inviting some of the speakers. Lynn O'Grady and Jeannie Caldwell, I told them they were the energizers in this whole thing, the enthusiasm, taking care of all of the details and making sure people were catching a vision for this and presenting the table out in the courtyard, all of that. We really thank the two of you for really spearheading this and moving it forward. Mark and I were also on the committee, but the idea committee, not so much the details of the committee, but we are very honored to be here. Peggy Flynn, of course, handling all of the details that she does so competently. So thank you all for all of the work that went behind to get us here this evening, and we are so glad you're here. A lazy, wonderful Sunday afternoon, and here you are going to class, and we hope you'll all end up feeling like this was worth it. Yet to come, of course, Mark and I will begin to see. By the way, Mark and I we both have been professors along the way. We've never taught before together, so this is cool. This is really fun for us to be together, to be sharing our thoughts around this, as we often do. We'll come out probably with little different angles, but that's what's healthy and good. And anyway, we're very glad to be here together. But then my dear friend, Dr. Ron White, will be here for the next two Sundays, bringing words on Martin Luther and Calvin. He's a historian, as most of you know. Will bring some real expertise to this. And then Dr. Becky King Serling will talk. She's a medieval historian of the Middle Ages, and she will bring thoughts around women and children in the whole Reformation period. So delightful, just terrific. We will then come, and Mark and I will come back for sessions in late October and November. I have a word to give here, though, a confession, full disclosure, whatever. Sharon and I leave for Asia on Wednesday, and this was planned long time ago. Then when we planned this session, I said, wait a minute, I can't be there. So the program will go on, but Lord willing, and trust me, Lord willing, we're going to the place where there's a lot of activity these days and a lot of, really fear. We've been monitoring it every day. We're going on a cruise. We presume they're monitoring it every day, but we will be out and be away for the next 3 Sundays. So I am absolutely delighted to be here. I have a lot of enthusiasm about the topic. I've done a lot of refreshing in preparation for this, just to get myself back into this extraordinarily fascinating period of history. I loved what you just said, Jen, too. It has been a spiritual deepening for me to get back into this material, to read it. I want to talk about that as we go through this evening. I feel a little like one Sunday I was teaching in Seattle. Sharon and I are from Seattle over the last 20 years. I was the president at Seattle Pacific University, as some of you know. And I was teaching at our church in Seattle. And I was teaching on the great biblical poets of exile. the prophets, we call them, Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and these. So I had a series going with this. And so one day I was presenting in a PowerPoint a wonderful painting by Rembrandt called Jeremiah, Lamenting the Loss of Jerusalem. Beautiful painting. We've got a print of it in our house, and we actually saw it in the Rijksmuseum two summers ago. An extraordinary painting by Rembrandt. So I'm holding forth up there and talking about Rembrandt as if I know what I'm talking about, and all of a sudden I realized one of my faculty members in the audience was an art historian with a PhD from Harvard, and I'm going, really? Do I have much to say about Rembrandt with this audience? And so as we're ending the session, I said, so Katie, what did you think about my thoughts about Rembrandt, my interpretation of the painting? And she mumbled a few encouraging words, and I realized there was a real expert in the room, and it was not I, it was she, and I have a little bit of that feeling tonight. There are a lot of you who know an awful lot about the Reformation, and we have former pastors who have studied this. We have our own pastors who have studied it. There's a lot of people who are reading along the way, getting into this whole thing. So I hope we really do have something to say as we move forward here, and hope you enjoy it. I hope you can get into it ways that I have been feeling this. It's just, it is an extraordinary period of time, and some deep, wonderful writing out of this period. We're going to read some of that tonight, and so I hope you enjoy it as I have been enjoying it. So here we go. How do we begin? How do we begin with this sprawling, swirling, active, incredible period in history? This is the 500-year celebration of the launching of the Reformation, of the beginnings of the Reformation. As you all know, that's why we're here. That's why we're doing these things. So here are some things that I hope we will tackle together. I hope we can get some grasp of the astonishing, this astonishing moment in history. Why? Who? When? Where? All of that. So some of that, I hope we get some feel of that by the time we are finished. I would like to focus on Luther tonight, but there is also, of course, John Calvin, chief among them, the other ones, the others voices within this great period. He from France in the beginning on and settled in Geneva, as most of you know. John Knox in Scotland, Ulrich Zwingli and Philip Melanchthon, both of them from Germany, who sometimes differed with Luther. And then there's the whole eccentric case of Henry VIII in England, and how England all unfolded with this whole thing. Thomas Cranmer, an original supporter of Henry VIII, who eventually wrote, by the way, the Book of Common Prayer for the Anglican Church, which is used to this day. One of the reformers, one of the Reformation voices. And then there's Abraham Kuyper in Holland, just to name a few. Amazing. By the way, Abraham Kuyper, my friend Rich Now, who was a longtime president at Fuller, Kuyper is his favorite. He's the one that Rich likes to focus on. And then, of course, there are all the nation states that were lining up during this period. There was Rome and all of Italy, Spain, France, all of them lining up with the Mother Church, staying with the Mother Church, staying with the Catholic Church. There was then Germany, Sweden, Scandinavian countries, Switzerland, Scotland, all of them lining up in some form or another, all with nuances, of course, but lining up around the Protestant position. So wow, a lot going on there, a lot of exciting historical unfolding that's going on during this period. and we will watch it and talk about it with great interest. It was a sometimes messy time, sometimes brutal, by the way, and bloody. People started fighting with one another over the opinions that were being formed here, but what a really an extraordinary time. So I also hope that we can get some grasp of the political, social, economic, and cultural explosions that were happening through this period of time. This was the beginning of what we call the modern era. This was the splitting off of the Middle Ages. This was a huge seismic shift that was taking place culturally, and very exciting as that happened. This is when the Western world broke its long-standing commitment to the medieval, informed by the medieval period. It was the moment when Europe broke apart in nation states. All of that was going on. So the whole national configurations, the choosing of where you were going to line up, all of that was going on. It was a time of the initial flowering, by the way, just through this period, right after Luther was appearing, of the Renaissance. That great period of literature and architecture, a great flowering, a blossoming, unbelievable unleashing of human creativity. This was happening right after, Luther. That in those periods, this is a period of Shakespeare. It was, and so many others, of course. It was the early stages of philosophical humanism. There's a lot that even comes out of the thoughts of the Reformation folks, the reformers, that encouraged actually humanism, which was a positioning sometimes quite contrary to religious faith. It was the first glimpses. We got the first glimpses of the age of reason and the age of enlightenment, where, of course, then began the whole age of science and the beginnings of understanding how we look at the world with scientific lens. It was the first glimpse we got of secularism, when God was moved off of the center of the stage. God was moved out of the center of the universe, and a lot of people's thinking and the individual was put into the center. With a whole lot of great things that came from that, of emphasizing the individual, but of course a lot of damage as well. A lot of dangerous things happened when the individual was elevated, and we still live with that legacy. Both sides of it, by the way. We're all individualists in this room. There is no question about it. But we also know the limitations of individualism. We begin to discover that all of the time. This was the unleashing of the individual, and a moment in which God was pushed off the stage. It was also the explosion of learning and literacy as the printing press, and Luther capitalized on that hugely, by the way. It was almost, you get to looking at some of this stuff, how the printing press supported and facilitated the spread of Protestantism and Lutheranism. It's almost as if you're thinking these days, the event of the internet. I mean, it was explosive what happened. The people could read the Bible on their own. Luther, as you know, translated the Bible into German, and that was then printed and published and then put out to the world, and people began to discover on their own in the vernacular language. And so the printing press had this huge influence. It was a time of deeper exploration, of course, and the eventual settling of America. And that was expanding people's consciousness, their understanding of what the world was and the limits of what they originally understood as the limits of the known world. And of course, as you know, then those reformers, the Puritans, in the Reformation spirit, and ventured out across the Atlantic and began to colonize, form the colonies in the Northeast. So, what a moment of history it is. Right? I mean, unbelievable. Unbelievable, so much going on. So let me say, though, also, I hope that as we go through this period, I hope we will all be thinking about the profound theological and spiritual issues behind the Reformation. I'd like to say that our secular historians sometimes want to discredit, sometimes wants to discount the whole spiritual theological thrust of this thing, but in my opinion, it all begins with those theological and spiritual yearnings, those theological and spiritual convictions, deep, passionate convictions on the part of these great reformers. And I hope that we can take a real good look at those issues, is basically what I want to talk about tonight. Eventually, by the way, I hope we can also talk about the Reformation together, about the impact on the church. What does the Reformation have to say to the church worldwide, to the relationship that the Protestants have with Catholics, in our day even, in that day, but in our day, what can we learn? We need to think about how the Reformation can speak to our own church, the San Marino Community Church here. What might the Reformation have to teach for us in terms of renewal? This was a time of powerful, profound renewal. What might the Reformation have to say even to us? Then finally, I hope we can learn something about how to stand up and talk about what we believe. This was huge. If Luther hadn't been willing, hadn't been courageous enough, hadn't been able to stand up and say what he believed, nothing would have happened. I think that's the title, by the way, the subtitle of my new book, which will be coming out in several months ahead. How is it that we say what we believe in an age of unbelief? I think that's where we are today, and I think the Reformation has a whole lot to say to us. We tend to back off in this age of unbelief, be a little afraid, be a little embarrassed. Well, how do we say what we're going to, how do we say that to our secular neighbors? How do we say it to a secular world? How do we speak? How do we step on a platform? How do we write? How do we say what we believe in an age of the reformers? We're doing it, and they can help us in how to find that language, how to find the courage, how to find ways in which we can talk about what we believe. So, here's what happened to me as I began to look at the Reformation again. As you all are looking at it again, I know you've been there and I know you've reflected on it. As I began to read and reread much of this stuff in the last couple of weeks, I came to discover once again that I am quintessentially Protestant. So what do you think about that? Or does that ring true for you? I think we've got to think about what it means to be Protestant. That's what we're doing. But I came to affirm once again that I am a Protestant. I've got some things I want to say about the Catholic Church too. But right now, just beginning, just confession, just to admit, get the cards on the table, I am quintessentially Protestant. I remember when I first became president at Seattle Pacific, I was sitting in a meeting. I'd called the meeting. I'd gathered a bunch of people, including a bunch of our faculty, and I said, we need to write, this is a very Protestant thing to do, by the way, I said, we need to write a new statement of faith for the university. Where do we stand in the whole spectrum of what it means to be Christian, what it means to be a Christian university? Where are we on that? Everybody was wondering where I was as the new president, by the way. So where's the president going to come out on this thing? So we're having this discussion in this crusty, sometimes eccentric faculty member. I was a new president, understand he needed to challenge me. He knew he needed to challenge. By the way, I grew to love this guy. He was just one of my favorites. But at that moment, he said, I want you to know that the School of Theology faculty, are the true magisterium in the university. We are the ones that can interpret what the identity of this place ought to be. When it comes to faith, when it comes to understanding Scripture, we're the ones who need to be the main voice, if not the only voice, to shape what it is we're going to say in a statement of faith. Well, I gotta tell you, the hair on the back of my neck stood up a little bit, and I said, really? Magisterium? That stuff comes out of the Reformation. That is, in fact, what Catholics believe. I said, we're Protestants. We don't believe in a magisterium. You understand that term? I mean, it's all the teachings of the church. We base things on the Scripture. So I'm lecturing to my theology faculty member, and I'm saying we are all part of the priesthood of believers. We are each able to say what it is, how it is. We each have the chance, the opportunity to be able to articulate what the Scriptures are saying to us. Okay, so I was the Protestant. He turns out to be the pre-Reformation voice, even the Catholic voice. So he was very, very much Protestant. So we had this little standoff. That's what it means to be Protestant. All of those issues came out for me. That it is we, each of us, who are empowered by really the teachings of the Reformation to interpret Scripture on our own as individuals. We in fact place the Scriptures at the center of everything we think about faith and the church. All of that is vitally, vitally important. And let me be real clear here as we begin. I love the Catholic Church. So many of my friends are Catholic. I have a friend a professor at Notre Dame, Chris Smith, who just converted to Catholicism from a real, true evangelical faith. Surprised us all. I couldn't believe it. Sometimes I find myself tempted by that. There are some great things that happen in the Catholic Church. Hope that doesn't sound heretical to you, but there is a beauty there that I think we must recognize. I've studied the medieval period, especially the monastics and the contemplative tradition. I've studied some of the church fathers. I've studied Augustine. I have tried to study St. Thomas Aquinas. Been hugely influenced by St. Benedict. I have been hugely benefited from the teaching and model and stature of Pope John Paul II. And by the way, I love the Mass. I think Protestants have much to learn about the Eucharist, the way it is celebrated in the Catholic Church, the kind of reverence and ritual they bring to it, the kind of lifting up of Christ at the center, the mystery of Christ at the center of the Mass. I love all of that. And yet, we are talking about a particular point in time when there was a true break from that, and there was need for a true break from that. I think sometimes, by the way, when Protestants are reading the Catholic Church in this moment of Reformation, we tend to be too tough on the Catholics. We rag on them too hard. I grew up with that kind of ragging. I don't know whether some of you did, but Catholics were totally suspect in my upbringing. And I think there's too much of that goes on here, even in the readings that you have from Protestants looking at their own Protestant Reformation, their own Protestant revolution. There is too much ragging on the Catholics at times. So I want to say that to begin with. Let's be careful there. Was there corruption going on? There absolutely was corruption. Were there things that they got wrong in terms of what was happening at the moment of Luther and the launching of this whole thing? Were there things they were doing wrong? Was there a discrediting and a sidelining of the scriptures? Was there power? There were power trips that were going on among the clergy. Absolutely all of that was going on. And Luther stood up and said, this really runs counter. Well, we didn't have a Protestant tradition that he could turn to. He was making it up. He says, this really feels like it runs counter to my reading of Holy Scripture. So what is it that the Protestants, who are we? What do we do? Where are we? What do we think? By the way, there are 33,000 Protestant denominations in our world. 33,000. When this thing got unleashed, I mean, it was like people decided, you got some disagreements with the denomination you're in, just form a new one. Move on. And that has been happening throughout history. There's a really wonderful statement, by the way, called the Reforming Catholic Confession. They put that word Catholic in there because they want to read it as sort of universal belief among Protestants. What is it that is our Catholicity as Protestants? They just put it out last week. Some of you may have seen it. The subtitle is A Mere Protestant Statement of Faith. And the whole question behind it, they gathered a bunch of scholars and a bunch of leaders. They asked me to sign on. By the way, I am a signator. I decided to sign it. I love the statement. You could take a look at it. It's really worth looking at. You can find it online. The Reforming Catholic Confession, just out. But their whole question is, 33,000 denominations under our umbrella as Protestants. How can we bring this together? Do we really understand what it is we believe together? Can we make a statement somehow that seems to capture both theologically, and then they go on in the second section just to talk about our practice together? How is it that we can truly come together as a church? I think that's a very important question for us to ask, by the way, even as we go through this class. So what do we believe together? How can we then be a universal church as we face a pervasively predominant secular world that surrounds us? By the way, the Pew Research Center on Religion and Public Life just last week also, all of this is happening because of the 500th year, so everybody's putting this stuff out. There is a study they just put out that said that Protestants really don't know what they believe. Okay, that sola scriptura, sola fide, the big ideas around the Reformation. 57% of Protestants don't even know what it is. So I mean, whoa, and then we've got something we really need to learn, right? I mean, something we really need to take a look at. So all of this going on, and we ask the question, what really do we believe? So let me zero in now on what I think is the heart of the matter, the heart of the Reformation. Let me see. These are my thoughts, okay? And I would love any reaction with this. To begin with, I believe that it is those theological drivers that are really driving this movement. And it is these deep convictions around spiritual matters, how we live our spiritual life, how it is we come into contact with our majestic God. How is it that how do we deal with our own sinfulness, our own shortcomings? These are the theological issues that were driving this whole thing, and I think it's a big question for us. So what were those drivers? And that's what I want to look at. Let me start with a statement, not by a reformer, though he's very Protestant, the great 20th century theologian and missiologist Leslie Newbigin. If you've not read Newbigin, get a book by Newbigin. He is fabulous. He was for 30 years or such a missionary to India. He learned how it was that you talk your faith across cultures, even for him across language barriers. How is it that you do that? He wrote all of these wonderful books. But here's one thing he said that I've been carrying with me for years and years. What we have to do, he said, what you and I have to do, what we have to do in the he was writing in the 20th century, but in the 21st century, is what the church fathers and Augustine had to do in an age when classical culture had lost its nerve and was disintegrating. Okay, he's saying that's the kind of culture we live in. It's coming apart, splintering. We know the splintering, we feel it every day. How do we talk across barriers? How do we talk across all kinds of various things that put us into silos? He said, what they had to do, what the church fathers had to do, what Augustine had to do, is to speak a word that offered up a new starting point for thought. A big thing. In other words, you've got to get down to the basics. You've got to get what really matters. A new starting point for thought. We've got to regroup. We've got to start again. We've got to start fresh. And that's precisely what Luther was doing. And what I think is important about using Newbigin here is to say, he's talking about our own time. He's going clear back to the early formation of the Christian church. And then we can put Luther right into that whole, Luther and the Reformers, right into that whole pattern. Every step along the way, we must take a look, regroup, reach down deeply, think through afresh, a new starting point for thought. So let's watch the way Luther did that. I think that's exactly what he did. So here we are, in our point in time, looking in on Luther, looking in on these reformers, discovering what they were discovering. By the way, some of the writings are just scintillating. I mean, well, maybe not for everybody, but they really are wonderful. They're just fantastic. They are impassioned. They are exciting. To watch Luther make his own discoveries about what was motivating him. That's what they were doing, digging down. They were digging down to find that new starting point for thought. So let me propose that Luther, in his formative years, as he was forming all of his thought that ended up being the Reformation, that ended up being his writings, that ended up, by the way, as I will show, preceding the 95 Theses on the church door. All of this thinking was going on for him preceding that. I want to say there were 2 lightning bolts and one, what is called the Tower experience. 3 formative moments that we look in and we see in Luther's life and seeming to be shaping him, very formative happenings in his life. So first, he was actually, when he was 21 years old, in 1505, he was walking down the road, down a pathway at the University of Erfurt in Germany, where he was a student, and he was struck by a bolt of lightning. Literally, this is true, okay? You get sometimes you get these historians scoffing at some of these stories, and I tend to say, well, but there had to be something, Well, did it really happen? Yes, I think it did happen. He was struck by lightning. And what happened is it threw him on the ground. And he's saying, oh, Lord, what is happening here? And he prayed out to St. Anne, who was the patron saint of his area, the mining area. She was the patron saint of miners. His father was in the business of mining. St. Anne, save me. If you will save me, I will join a monastery. So what was the frame of mind of Luther? I think we can learn a lot about this little incident, that he looked at the world and he felt like God spoke in these kind of ways. In the medieval world, he's seeing that something is happening. He takes it as a sign that somehow he is maybe off track, off of path, and he's saying, okay, God, I will join a monastery. And he became a monk. He said one time, he said, if ever a monk was got to heaven by his monkery, I was it. He became a good monk. He was a Catholic, of course, deeply a part of the Catholic Church. He entered into all the practices of the monastery, prayer, the meditation, constant worship, confession of sins. Intensely, by the way, we understand Luther confessed his sins, irritated some of his friends in the monastery. You confess too much, Luther. They told him that. And such petty things. Why are you taking that to a confessor? And he had these deep convictions about his own sinfulness. So there was another lightning bolt, another discovery. That was a formative time. Changed his life, of course. He became a monk. Entered the monastery, entered deeply into an intensified spiritual living. That's what the monastery is all about. So the second thing that happened, he was becoming a priest in a monastery. Not all monks are priests, by the way, but he was becoming a priest and was going through the rites, and he had to serve his first communion. His first Holy Communion, the Eucharist. And he became so anxious over this experience that he, a sinful person, a nobody, that he would come into the presence of Christ, that he would actually, as Catholics then believed and do believe, would lift up the body of Christ in the Eucharist. It terrified him. I'm not worthy to do that. This is the intense kind of person he was. The self-reflection, the deeper understanding of what faith was all about. He said, I'm not worthy to conduct. He almost backed out. He says, I was utterly stupefied and terror-stricken. Who am I that I should lift up mine eyes or raise my hands to the divine majesty? So this was such an intense moment in time. He almost backed out, but decided he would move forward. He became a priest, of course. But a very important, telling moment, I think, in the life of Luther to tell us what sort of person he was. Now, this plays into where we're headed. So those are two formative moments. Then now let's pause and look at the 95 Theses for a moment. So stay with me. We've got another moment, a formative moment coming, which was huge. But in these all happened way prior to 1510, way prior to the 95 Theses. In 1517, as we all know, on October 31st or November 1st, we're not quite sure, All Souls Day, by the way, or All Saints Day, Luther apparently, some question about whether it really happened, but it has lived in the historical memory full force, and that is he nailed up these 95 Theses and said, here's what I believe. It was a challenge, by the way, this nailing up was a challenge to debate. To all those who were interested at the surrounding university, it was a challenge to debate. Let's talk about these things. Let's really look at them. And he was, and by the way, this was the Wittenberg door. I mean, this is what the Wittenberg door that you all know about. Sharon and I visited this, by the way, this door with Darrell Bruder. Some of you know Darrell, a wonderful, wonderful professor at Princeton, good friend of mine. He was the world's authority on the church behind the Iron Curtain, and took a group of us in 1992, is that right, Sharon? I think that's about right. Yeah, right after the Berlin Wall had fallen and East Germany had opened up, and took us to the door and all these sites that were back behind the Iron Curtain and inaccessible. Anyway, I know a lot of you have been there. But when you look at these theses, take a look at them, read them. They're really not very substantive. It is not, they feel a little scattered, kind of all over the place. Of course, he challenges the Pope, which was very scary territory. Of course, he questions many times in the 95, the indulgences, which is where people were needing to pay for their salvation, essentially, for forgiveness of sin. Pope Leo, as you know, at that time was trying to build St. Peter's in Rome. That magnificent cathedral that we all now enjoy, magnificent in planning, but it required a whole lot of money. And so they went out across the Catholic world and were asking people to pay these indulgences. That's what the indulgence thing is all about. Pay these indulgences in order to get forgiveness. And if you paid enough, you got actual forgiveness from the Pope himself. So Luther felt like something's wrong. This is not right. This doesn't work. This isn't good. And so he put out the 95 Theses, and he does attack those, but as you read them, this is not really substantive Luther. This is combating Luther. There's no question about that. Sometimes cantankerous Luther. This is bold Luther, because he was putting himself out there and doing some challenging of the power structure, no question about that. But this is not deep Luther. So, if that was 1517, let's go back now for this tower experience, which I think really leads us into the heart of the matter for the Reformation. Back up, this is pre-Wittenberg door. That's the point I want to make. All of this stuff now is pre-thinking on his part, pre-exploration at the deepest levels of what he believed. So in 1513, he began lecturing on the Book of Psalms at the university at Burford, where he was teaching. He began studying the Psalms. It became very important to him. In the fall of 1515 now, big stuff began to happen. He began lecturing on the Book of Romans during that semester. All of that was preceded by, of course, a lot of study in the Book of Romans. Romans becomes very, very important in the Reformation. He said Romans, in truth, is the most important document in the New Testament. This is Luther. This is Luther's language. The gospel in its purest expression. How do you feel about that? I'm not sure about it sometimes, but he was drawn into it powerfully, profoundly, in a life-shaping kind of way. The Book of Romans was speaking to him. Not only is it well worth a Christian's while to know it word for word by heart. Can you imagine memorizing the Book of Romans? I mean, holy Toledo. But he did. He knew it by heart, but also to meditate on it day and night. It is the soul's daily bread and can never be read too often or studied too much. Okay, so 1515, he's giving these lectures on Romans. You can read them, by the way. They are available to us and translated into English. Then, throughout 1516 and 1517, so still we are prior to nailing the theses on the door, he followed up with his commentary on the book of Galatians, another extraordinary reading for him. When you read that, the lectures, I suppose, on Galatians, it's like a little book. I mean, it is really very good reading. I think, anyway. I hope you would find that. So here, then, we have this other formative event. He is sitting in the tower. This is the image that has now moved out through history, and we claim it as the tower experience for Luther. He's sitting in the tower, his study, in the monastery, studying Romans, studying the Psalms first, studying Romans, studying Galatians, and the lightning bolt hit him. I mean, it came clear to him. Have you ever had that kind of experience? I mean, this was like a conversion experience. It flipped his whole notion of what faith was all about, what his relationship to God was all about. Flipped it upside down. His world completely changed. He uses the language of born again, by the way, which we do not, which we sort of discredited in our day, and unfortunately, Luther's using it in 15 and 16, saying, I felt born again, like I was a different person, like I saw the whole of Scripture in different kinds of ways. This was the deep moment in the study as he read Romans, as he read these books, as he prepared for his lectures. This, again, all preceding the 95 Theses. We interpret the 95 Theses as too politically. All of this theological preparation preceded it. It led to his convictions that are contained in the 95 Theses. Now, let me read from this discovery moment. This stuff is just fabulous. By the way, this is from Roland Baton's Here I Stand, A Life of Martin Luther. It's a classic little biography. My dates of having read it were when I was in college. It's obviously yellow. It's been around. I've had it for a long time, but it still is regarded as one of the really fine biographies of Luther, and I think it is. I have reread it in the last couple of weeks. It's just fabulous. But here's Luther now, right? This is Roland Baton's translation of Luther as he's writing about this experience in the tower, about the experience in the tower, reading the book of Romans. This is what he came to. I greatly longed. But by the way, he is still wrestling with his own sinfulness. We saw that in the other formative moments in his life. So this is a huge thing to him. He's intensely spiritual. Believes that he has failed in a whole lot of things, and he was not measuring up to God's expectation of him. Have you ever had that experience? And we're all there. We know what this is. A sense of, have I done enough? What more do I need to do to be okay? What different kind of person do I need to be? We're all there. So he's wrestling with this. And then he's reading Paul, and he says, I greatly long to understand Paul's epistle to the Romans. And nothing stood in the way but that one expression, the justice of God. That's the thing that hooked him, that he didn't know how to get through that. How do I deal with the justice of God? I feel so puny and inadequate up against the justice of God, the righteousness of God, because I took it to mean that justice, whereby God is just and deals justly in punishing the unjust. So he's really wrestling with this stuff, you understand? I mean, this is big, deep, personal stuff. He's really anguishing over his own unjustness. My situation was that although an impeccable monk, we heard that before, he believes he was although I was an impeccable monk, I stood before God as a sinner with a troubled conscience. And I had no confidence in my merit that I would assuage him, God. Therefore, I did not love a just God. Wow, this is so frank. I got to tell you, it's almost heretical. But he says it. Therefore, I did not love a just and angry God. He realizes this. He comes to this kind of soul searching. I realize if this is what God is, I really didn't even love him, but rather hated and murmured against him. Yet I clung to dear Paul, and had a great yearning to know what he meant. What was he saying in the book of Romans? Night and day I pondered until I saw the connection between the justice of God and the statement that the just shall live by his faith. Now, this is the discovery. You understand what's happening here? Wait a minute. This just God, Paul is saying the just shall live by faith. Then I grasp that the justice of God is that righteousness by which, through grace and sheer mercy of God, that God justifies us through faith. The merciful God, the lavishly loving God. I discovered there is, no, wait a minute, we've been misreading this thing, that we have to earn God's justice, that we have to earn God's love. Saying, wait a minute, through faith I can believe that I am already justified. Thereupon I felt myself to be reborn and to have gone through open doors into paradise. A new life, new release, liberation, new confidence in himself and his faith and who he was, loved by God. Imagine that. Such a sinner, loved by God. I love this too, the whole of Scripture. By the way, they used to print books very, very small print. It is amazing. But in any case, the whole of Scripture took on a new meaning. In other words, the insight, the pivotal insight for him, changed his way of looking at all the rest of Scripture. I love that. He's born again. He's born anew. He's changed. He's transformed by a discovery, reading in his study, that God is righteous and God loves me, and that I can live in his righteousness, that through Christ the door is open for me, that God loves me. Whereas before the justice of God had filled me with hate, now it became to me inexpressibly sweet in greater love. This passage of Paul became to me a gate to heaven. He didn't mean here, by the way, I don't think a gate to heaven beyond in eternal life, though it is that, and he believed that. He means heaven now. I've discovered this, I'm released, I'm transformed, I can now relax in the love of God. Then finally he says, if you have a true faith that Christ is your Savior, then at once you have a gracious God, for faith leads you in and opens up God's heart and will. Isn't that great? Opens up God's heart and will. We can walk in. That you should see pure grace and overflowing love. This it is to behold God in faith, that you should look upon his fatherly, friendly heart. A total discovery, new discovery of God and who God is, and God that God loves him, in which there is no anger nor ungraciousness. He who sees God as an angry God does not see him rightly, but looks only on a curtain, as if a dark cloud has been drawn across his face. Amazing, huh? That's the heart of the matter. It seems to me this is the driver. This is where it all came from. I talked a whole lot about Christ in this whole thing and other passages. He talks, by the way, that we are released in this confidence of God's love for us, we are released into love for others. He talks about that a lot. So that it is not just for me alone, but it is in loving others. Luther is extremely well-rounded here, I think, and it is where we get a lot of what we believe. So I need to pause. And Mark now is going to come up. Well, why don't we stand up and I don't know, get another goodie or something. So my son Mark is going to take over now, and he's going to set everything right that I got wrong, okay? But I'm really looking forward to hearing him. I wanted to recommend one more book before I got off the stage here. And this is Martin Luther's Selections from His Writings. It is a really good collection of the originals of Martin Luther's original, and it's edited with an introduction by John Dillenberger, who has written a whole lot on this Reformation period. But anyway, this is a fabulous book of collection to read Luther in the original. Not the original language, but I mean in the primary work, the primary writing of this great figure. Okay, Mark.
Okay, great. I think my mic's on. So wonderful. Thanks so much to Lynn and Jeannie for inviting me to be a part of this. It's so great to teach along with my dad. I had a class from him as an undergraduate student. And, you know, in the church we often talk about PKs, preacher's kids. It's kind of a unique growing up experience, but I consider myself a PK because I was a professor's kid. And it's a sort of different sort of one. So I think I have, you know, just enough time to kind of do what I plan to do, which is to kind of first sort of summarize this book, this short introduction, very short introduction to the Reformation by Peter Marshall. So hopefully some of you had a chance to try to comb through that. And so I'm going to do that. And I'm going to focus in particular on this issue of the sacrament of the Eucharist and the way that was a kind of central controversy. I think it's wonderful the way my dad, I think, sort of established that theology really was at the heart of the Reformation. And so it's good to kind of have that, you know, have that kind of basic understanding that theology was so important to what was happening. This book is taking a very historical perspective, and it has, I think, some good perspectives for us to think about. So that's what I'm going to do, and then in a later class, I'm going to talk about the novels about the Reformation by Hilary Mantel. Let me first just point out that there's some opportunities this fall, as you might imagine, to kind of supplement this course if you're interested in. So first off, we're going to have a conference at Azusa Pacific University where I teach called Reformation Reverberations. And so in October, on Thursday, October 12th, one of the plenary speakers is going to be Brad Gregory from Notre Dame, who's written this pretty terrific book called The Unintended Reformation. So he's going to be the speaker on Thursday night. And then on Friday, October 13th, at 7 p.m., Lorianne Farrell, who teaches at Claremont Graduate University, is going to be another plenary speaker. And then a little bit closer to home, but in December, after our fall spiritual formation class is over, the Huntington Library is going to have a conference, a 2-day conference called Globalizing the Protestant Reformation. And that's going to be the real deal. I mean, if you want to hear about from some scholars that are really, experts in this area, I would encourage you to go to that as a kind of culmination for this class. One of the featured speakers there is Anthony Grafton, a professor at Princeton University. They're also bringing a gentleman by the name of David Hall, who I actually got to know quite well when he was here at the Huntington as a fellow. David Hall teaches at Harvard Divinity School, and he is probably the world's leading expert on the Puritans. in early America. So that's just some extra opportunities. And then, as I mentioned, later this fall, I believe on November 12th, I'm going to be back up here talking about Hilary Mantel, who is a historical novelist from England. She's written these two wonderful books about Henry VIII, and specifically from the point of view of Thomas Cromwell. Some of you probably know these books. They were bestsellers, New York Times bestsellers. Both novels won the Booker Prize, and she has a third. This is the first one. Back one. So this is the first one called Wolf Hall, and so that came out in 2009. The second one is called Bring Up the Bodies, and there's actually a third one on the way called The Mirror and the Light, which hopefully is going to come out soon to round out this trilogy of books. So what we're going to do in that session is just kind of think about what we can learn about the Protestant Reformation through historical fiction. And so hopefully, I mean, I'm just mentioning it now because these are pretty big books. You might want to try to read one or maybe even both of them before we do that. Hilary Mantel was here in May at a conference on historical fiction that I was involved in, and her papers are actually at the Huntington Library. So she was fantastic. So here's Thomas Cromwell, who I just mentioned. That's sort of who these two novels focus on. And then also Thomas More is one of the leading figures in these books too. We happened to be in New York this summer, and so we went to the Frick collection. And I guess I hadn't realized that these two paintings of Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell, both by Holbein, are right next to each other in the Frick Museum. And it's just amazing to see them facing off on the mantle there at the Frick. So I'll just end my little preliminary marks with this image of Hilary Mantel, the author. And this was an illustration that appeared in the New Yorker when James Wood reviewed her second volume in that trilogy. So it's a after Holbein image of the author Hilary Mantel. Okay, so that brings me to this book, The Reformation by Peter Marshall. Peter Marshall may well be one of the speakers at the Huntington conference later this fall. He's a pretty well-known scholar. I also read a couple of other books by him in preparation for this, including this one, the Oxford Illustrated History of the Reformation. I have a handout, and I'm going to be kind of quoting from this book primarily, but also a couple of other sources as I kind of go through and try to unpack what I thought his main points in this book were, okay? So he starts off the book with a kind of a basic question, something worth thinking about. What is the Reformation? But specifically, was there actually such a thing as the Reformation? He thinks that's worth kind of thinking about for a minute. The term, after all, was not used until long after the events it is meant to describe. And so, is this term a useful term as like a historian? And so he ends up at the end of the introduction on page 9. This is my first quotation. He ends up saying, yes, we can keep using the term, which seems kind of obvious, actually, because there's another thing about these terms that once they've been used for so long to describe a historical moment, there's sort of like no getting around them, even if they are somewhat anachronistic. But he says on page 9, this book stands by the usefulness of the term for a simple but crucial reason. The Reformation designates both the period and the process through which a key principle established itself at the heart of European culture, the formation of identity by means of division and conflict. During this era, markers of religious difference sprang up across innumerable aspects of life. Now, I don't know how that sounds to you guys as like a summing up of the Reformation. That's his take, is that it introduced this idea of that we form our identities by means of division and conflict, and it specifically brought up during this period, there sprang up a number of markers of religious difference. So that's kind of his take on, one of the biggest legacies of the Reformation. But again, I would come back to what Dad sort of helped us understand, that really theology and the faith was at the heart of it. So I think he's kind of thinking more as a historian. Okay, good. So first off, he says, yes, there was a Reformation. We can stand by that term. And then secondly, I think one of the things this book is reminding us, and I think Dad also talked about this a little bit as well, is that historians nowadays think about the Reformation as having a much broader or expanded time frame, and also that it has a much bigger global reach. So they tend to argue that the Reformation lasted much longer than previously thought, but also that it had these kind of precursors that are worth thinking about, and that it was this sort of long process in all of these different kind of local contexts of unfolding, with a lot of different historical actors and historical forces kind of coming together to play out a little bit differently depending on the context, okay? So overall, it was this pretty seismic event in history, and it happened in lots of different places. So the protest that Martin Luther launched in 1517 is sort of a symbolic starting point to the Reformation, but it really probably began much earlier in some ways, or at least it was prepared for much earlier. And it also kind of reverberates long afterwards. He says that once Luther kind of staged this protest, that it rapidly took a radical and unexpected turn and sort of engulfed first Germany and then Europe as a whole in furious arguments about the sacraments, about liturgy, about the church, and perhaps above all about the Bible itself. And so he wants to kind of give these theological arguments their due, but he says, however, these theological debates, that these debates about these various things did not remain confined to a narrow sphere of theology, that they came to reshape politics and international relations, social, cultural, and artistic developments, relations between the sexes, and the patterns and performances of everyday life. And so they were also kind of a stimulus for Christianity as it transformed into a truly global religion. And what he says here is that the Roman Catholic Church sought to compensate for losses in Europe to these Protestant breakoffs with new conversions in Asia and America. So again, that kind of global reach of the Reformation. Okay, so whereas previous historians tended to kind of delimit the time span of the Reformation, he wants to kind of expand it, okay? So here's another quote I have on this expanded time frame. I talked about this. So this is the quote. But if the Reformation is defined as the period during which the religious culture of England changed from profoundly Catholic to emphatically Protestant, and the process by which that transformation came about, then a compact 16th century time frame simply will not do. Increasingly, the attention of historians is turning to the social and cultural aspects of religious change, the full effects of which took decades, if not generations, to become apparent. Over the last few years, the concept of a long Reformation has become widely accepted among historians. So here he's kind of zeroing in on England, but you see that his point is that we have to think about the Reformation as a kind of long, unfolding kind of process. So a good example of this, and one that he goes into a little bit, a good example is John Wycliffe, okay? He's a theologian at Oxford in England, but in the 14th century, okay? So well before what we think of as the Reformation. So he's not strictly speaking a reformer, and yet he kind of had this reformist impulse, all right? He taught, for example, that the only source of religious authority was the Bible, and that the church itself should have no property or political power. He also condemned the doctrine of transubstantiation, and he attacked aspects of popular religion like pilgrimage and the veneration of images. So the church didn't like what Wycliffe was saying, and they responded with persecution. They introduced the death penalty for heresy in 1401, and the English translation of the scriptures that was undertaken by Wycliffe's followers, the Wycliffe Bible, was banned in 1407. So here's what Peter Marshall has to say about John Wycliffe. He says, by the way, Wycliffe has variant spellings, and you'll see it spelled different ways in different places. But here's Peter Marshall on Wycliffe. He says, in England, the theologian John Wycliffe formulated an astonishingly radical critique of the church in his day, substituting the supreme authority of Scripture for that of the Pope, and arguing that clergymen should exercise no worldly authority. Wycliffe's followers were driven out of the universities, but managed to lay the foundations for an underground heretical movement, the Lollards, in the country at large. So this group, the Lollards, were the followers of Wycliffe even long after his death. It's sometimes referred to as Lollardy. And historians of the English Reformation still debate, to what extent the Lollards, in some sense, kind of presaged the English Reformation to come in the 1520s. So that's an example of kind of how you kind of want to go back earlier to think about how the Reformation happened in England. I mentioned that Wycliffe was an Oxford scholar. He was actually the master of Balliol College, so I wanted to put a few images in here to keep this interesting. So there's Balliol. They've also named a hall at Oxford after Wycliffe. This is Wycliffe Hall at the University of Oxford. Okay, so Wycliffe, as I mentioned, was behind an effort to start translating the Bible into English. But the big figure in terms of translating the Bible into the vernacular, into English, is going to be William Tyndale. And so this is a painting of Tyndale from the 17th century. But Tyndale, of course, came out with his translation into English of the New Testament in 1526. And this is considered the first Bible printed in English. It was considered heretical, okay, before England broke with the Roman Catholic Church. They basically banned the Testament that Tyndale had translated and published. And even though it was banned, though, many copies of his New Testament were smuggled into England. And if you could get your hands on it, lots and lots of people were really interested to see what it said. So I have here a photograph from the British Library of one of only two complete copies that survive from the 3,000 or more that were printed in 1526 in the German city of Worms. Now there were two slightly later editions, so there are more copies of that that have survived. But this was the original 1526 edition, okay? So that's the Tyndale New Testament. This is Tyndale, as some of you know, was martyred for his, for sedition. Henry charged him with sedition, and he was chased sort of throughout. He had moved to Belgium after being in Germany for a little while, and he was eventually burned at the stake. So this is an image from Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is actually the real title is Acts and Monuments of These Later and Perilous Days Touching Matters of the Church. better known as John Fox's Book of Martyrs. So this is Tyndale's execution. And after Tyndale, the Henry VIII actually kind of had a little bit of a change of heart, and he actually authorized this edition of the Bible in English, which is the Coverdale Bible from 1535. Ironically, this comes out just before Tyndale himself is actually executed. But this edition is very much based on Tyndale's translation, as is the Great Bible of 1539 here, that was also authorized by King Henry VIII. And the illustration on the Great Bible is by Holbein himself. You see that the King Henry VIII is on the top in the center of that Bible. Fascinatingly, I found this image of the Great Bible that's held by the British Library, and it says this particular Bible with its colored title page was very probably Henry VIII's personal copy, which is pretty remarkable. Okay, so that's a little bit about, and then as we know, the next great English Bible is the King James Bible, commissioned by King James and published in 1611. And this also bases a lot of its translations on Tyndale. So he was very a kind of formative influence on the Bibles to come. A super good book about this kind of history of the English Bible is by James Simpson, called Burning to Read. So I just want to throw that out there and recommend that. And he argues that, you know, this desire to read in the vernacular was a really kind of one of the things that kind of propelled the Reformation as it went along. Okay, so back to Marshall then. A third point I want to make about how he is describing this historical process. He asks us to consider whether the Reformation should be thought of as a singular event or as a bunch of different events under the umbrella of Reformation. So is it Reformation or is it Reformations, singular or plural? And so his answer to this is that we definitely want to think about it in this more kind of plural way. Reformation is giving way to plural reformations, multiple theological and political movements with their own directions and agendas. There were distinct national, regional, and local reformations, not all Lutheran and not all successful. Dogging the footsteps of Lutheranism was an ambitious rival brand of Protestant Christianity, often called in theological shorthand Calvinism, though Reformed Protestantism is the more correct label. Now, Calvin's movement at Geneva, it has sometimes been referred to as kind of the Second Reformation. But again, Marshall is calling for us to think about the Reformation as in more plural terms as the Protestant Reformations, okay? So I thought that was another point that was worth taking from this book. Number 4, I think Peter Marshall, as a historian, is asking us to kind of consider the Reformation from a less sectarian point of view and also a less teleological point of view. So what do I mean by this? He talks throughout the book about revisionist historians, and he also talks about these previous kind of myths about the Reformation. And I think what he's referring to, what I kind of gather, is that for a long time, the historiography of the Reformation has kind of been on the Protestant side, okay? So Protestant historians writing about the Protestant Reformation, and therefore kind of giving it a little bit of a sectarian sort of slant. Does that make sense? And another thing that I think he thinks that some of this history of the Reformation has done is it's assumed that things would turn out certain ways. So that's what we mean by teleological, that it's all pointing towards a telos that was sort of meant to be, okay? And so I think what he's calling for is an approach to the Reformation that is trying to kind of step back from any sort of sectarian bias, if that makes sense, okay? Now, part of that is that he's going to treat the Protestant Reformation alongside some Catholic reform movements that he thinks are equally important. And the quotation I have here for this less sectarian approach is this one, where he says, new spiritual and reforming energies within Catholicism predated the Protestant revolt. Okay, so Catholics were already thinking about reform in some ways, in various ways, within the Catholic Church or within the church. Some were diverted into it, but others not. Catholic reform was naturally shaped by an ongoing confrontation with Protestantism, just as Protestantism defined itself throughout its history in relation to a Catholic or Papist other. It makes little sense to consider the Catholic and Protestant Reformations separately from each other, and their contrasting, sometimes converging trajectories are treated side by side in this book. So again, he wants to kind of think about the Protestant Reformation in a kind of dialectical relationship with what was going on in the Catholic Church, because they're sort of responding back and forth in many ways. Okay? I think another part of trying to think about the Reformation in this kind of less sectarian way is to acknowledge how messy it was. Dad, you mentioned this, that it was like it was a very momentous period of change. You had in the arts the Renaissance going on as well. So in any period of like this kind of seismic or momentous change, the factors involved are going to be multifaceted. So I think he's trying to think through a lot of the different ways in which these events unfolded. Does that make sense? He's trying to kind of specify what is happening in lots of different areas. So in an event like this, some people are going to embrace new ideas, others are going to resist change, and some are going to kind of hold on to, the ones that are resisting change want to kind of hold on to traditional beliefs and practices. So I'll give you one way of thinking about this. There's a British cultural historian named Raymond Williams, and he came up with these kind of helpful terms for thinking about historical change. He said that in any given period, you have some ideas that are dominant, some that are kind of emergent, and some that are residual, that are like looking to be obsolete as things change. So dominant, emergent, and residual cultural ideas and forms, that can sort of be applied to any given historical period, okay? So, for example, the Reformation in England, I think, is an interesting case where a lot of people are kind of holding on to traditional beliefs. Henry VIII himself, always considered himself Catholic, and he would really insist on the real presence in the Eucharist. So I'm going to get into that a little bit more in a minute. So this has come up in Shakespeare studies as well, incidentally, because a lot of people are asking the question, how Protestant really was Shakespeare? Did he actually have some sort of affinities with Catholic beliefs and ideas? And so that's been a big debate with Shakespeare, but I think just in general, in the historians and the way they've covered the English Reformation, a lot of them are saying that traditional religion, as Eamon Duffy calls it in this book, The Stripping of the Altars, that traditional religion or Catholic religion was pretty persistent even as the Reformation was playing out. Does that make sense? As Marshall puts it, the revisionist scholarship of the past 2 decades has made a powerful case for a vibrant, popular religious culture in the parishes with little sign of disenchantment from the church and its teachings. So that's kind of what he looks at, is the way that traditional beliefs are kind of being held on to even as the changes are underway. Okay, so I'm going to shift quickly to number 5 here, and that is sacramentalism. And he spends quite a bit of time on this. And I just have this one and one other one to finish up. But in terms of the sacraments, Marshall says that the Mass had a really kind of central place in the late medieval religious imagination. That the Mass was said in Latin. This is my quote. I think I have this on the handout. That the Mass was said in Latin, that Christ became physically present among his people. The priest would stand with his back to the congregation at the high altar, but then he would actually lift the host and sort of present the miracle of transubstantiation to the lay people in the body of the church, or the nave, okay? And so when the priest repeated Jesus' words, "This is my body, this is my blood," the elements used in the ritual ceased to be bread and wine and became the real body and blood of Christ, a daily miracle which the theologians referred to as transubstantiation. So this issue became one of the bitterest debates in the Reformation. Okay, was Christ's body really there, corporeally, in real blood and flesh, in the sacraments of communion? And so that was a big debate that erupted all over the place. And in England, interestingly enough, Henry VIII really kind of held on to this idea of real presence for a very long time. So it was somewhat slower to change in the English Reformation compared to elsewhere. Okay. So I have here a passage from John. There's plenty of other biblical passages about this and the words of institution, etc. I'm going to talk about Luther, what his view was. His view was that the substances of the wine and bread sort of coexist side by side with the real presence of Christ's body and blood. So what Luther says is that it was in, with, and under the bread and the wine. It should be, and so a lot of people have called this, the Luther's view of this, consubstantiation as opposed to transubstantiation. But Luther himself did not use that word. Here's what Luther said about the Eucharist. I'm going to skip. This is a painting of Luther that's in the Uffizi in Florence. And then this Lucas Cranach did a number of different images. This one is from the Metropolitan Museum of New York. So here's Luther's kind of take on the Eucharist. If I were to say over all the bread there is, this is the body of Christ, nothing would happen. But when we follow his institution and command in the supper and say, this is my body, then it is his body. Not because of our speaking or our declarative word, but because of his command in which he has told us so to speak and to do, and has attached his own command and deed to our speaking. So I think it's fair to say that Luther's view is that there's still this kind of real presence, right? That it's not just symbolic, but it has a kind of a real performative force. Even if it's not the actual blood and body of Christ. Is that fair? So I think that's kind of where Luther came down. Now Calvin, on the other hand, did go to more of a kind of symbolic or figurative understanding of this, where it was a symbol of Christ's body and blood. So here's John Calvin from the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is his major work, 1536. He was critical of the fixation, as he put it, on this one thorny question of how Christ's body lies under the bread or under the form of the bread. And you can kind of hear him, I think, kind of thinking through what Luther is suggesting, is that it's somehow in or with or under the bread and the wine. But he sums up the Eucharistic debate as follows, and this is also on your handout. Some men, to prove themselves subtle, added to the simplicity of Scripture that he is really and substantially present. Still others went even farther. They said he has the same dimensions in which he hung on the cross. Others devised a wondrous transubstantiation. Others said the bread itself was the body. Others that it was under the bread. Others that only a sign and figure of the body were set forth. This is indeed an important matter over which great disputes of words and minds have arisen. So indeed as it is commonly established. But those who feel thus do not pay attention in the first place to the necessity of asking how Christ's body, as it was given for us, became ours, how his blood, as it was shed for us, became ours. But that means to possess the whole Christ crucified and to become a participant in all his benefits. Now, overlooking those highly important matters, in fact, neglecting and well-nigh burying them, our opponents fight over this one thorny question: how is the body devoured by us? So Calvin's answer to this whole question was that Christ's presence in the Eucharist was true rather than real, or spiritual rather than physical. Quote, the inward substance of the sacrament is annexed to the visible signs, unquote. And so Calvin himself characterizes his position as a kind of metonymic one, where it sort of substitutes. It's a figure of speech in which one term is substituted for another, okay? So you can see how for him it's kind of this more symbolic or spiritual truth of the matter, and not so much the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. The Catholic Church, of course, dug in its heels on transubstantiation. So in the Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563, the Catholic Church sought to reinforce this doctrine. If anyone denieth that in the sacrament of the most holy Eucharist are contained truly, really, and substantially the body, the blood, and the body together with the soul and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ, and consequently the whole Christ, but saith he is only therein as in a sign, or in figure, or virtue, let him be anathema. So anyone who denies this is heretical, in other words, okay? All right, so that's the whole Eucharistic debate, which I think kind of gets at the way in which the sacraments, and especially the sacrament of the Eucharist, was one of the biggest issues. So there's my quote, which is also on your handout from the Catholic Church. And then finally, I'm going to end with his conclusion, okay? So when he gets to the end of the book, there's quite a bit of kind of, I think, pretty complex stuff about Max Weber, for example, and his theory about the Protestant Reformation. And then I could say a lot more about what he has to say about confessionalization and secularization, and maybe if people have questions, I'm happy to talk about that afterwards. But when we get to the end of the book, he kind of sums up that there were some paradoxical outcomes of the Protestant Reformation, and he calls it the law of unintended consequences. So my final quote is his summation. The most significant outcomes of the Reformation can in fact be expressed as a succession of paradoxes. The Reformations, Protestant and Catholic, and remember he's trying to kind of look at them together, aimed at the creation of a social and religious uniformity and ended up producing forms of pluralism that were subsequently exported to and replicated in the farthest flung parts of the world. So they were aiming for religious uniformity, and they ended up creating this pluralism, religious pluralism. So that was one legacy. They promised to intensify the political and spiritual power of the state, and yet they generated a grammar and vocabulary by which the authority of the state could be challenged. They sought to eradicate heresy and false belief, but falteringly permitted the toleration of error to a previously undreamt of degree. They set out to sacralize the whole of society and ended up creating the long-term conditions for its secularization. So this is his, as a historian, kind of summing up and saying that, there were some unintended consequences in some ways and some paradoxes about what came out of the Reformation. You remember back to my very first quotation from Peter Marshall, where he basically says that what it led to was a world in which we think of religious differences as one of the things that distinguishes us from other people. So this kind of religious pluralism was one of the legacies of the Reformation. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, even though I have more to say about the English Reformation, etc., but we're out of time, so that's a perfect place to end.
Thank you, Vaughn. What a remarkable launch for this class. My gosh, there's enough content here to keep us all busy this week. We do have a couple of minutes, and I really want to honor our time. We positioned this time on a Sunday afternoon hoping that there weren't too many other conflicts that people had so they could be here, but also knowing that it was a great lead-in to perhaps going out for dinner or something like that. So you may have plans. We're going to finish at 6 o'clock. But there may be just a time for one or two questions for either Phil or Mark Eaton. So Phil, would you come on back up here and yes, Earl.
We talked about this run for sacrament.
Hold on just a second. I'm going to take this mic to you.
What about the sacrament of baptism and Anabaptism? Are we going to include that in the Reformation as part of the discussion? It seems very similar to what we just talked about.
Yeah, it does. The sacrament of baptism. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't have a whole lot to say about that. I mean, I did have a section here where I talk about, Peter Marshall talks about the 7 sacraments, and he says that confession and the Eucharist were ones that were supposed to be repeated in the life of the faithful person, but that the other 5, including baptism, were meant to kind of mark this one occasion, right? And so they were these singular events in a person's life. So that, I don't know, but was baptism also kind of one of the controversies in the Reformation?
Well, the Anabaptists were very...
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what I was going to say. The Anabaptists then took this on and influenced a whole lot of this breakout of denominations that baptism really can happen only after you become an adult and make a decision for Christ, then you are baptized. So the big issue here was, and Presbyterians, of course, believe in infant baptism, that you're welcoming this child into the congregation. That's one piece of it, and then as well presenting this baby before God, and there is this sacred blessing that takes place.
Question. Here's another one.
Yes, an interesting summary that you presented, and you touched on a little bit on the divisions that were created. Do you feel that this Reformation made the Western world a more hostile, violent place?
A response is no. I don't think so. Did the Reformation set loose and verify and confirm and bless divisions? Absolutely, yes. But I don't think if you read the originals, by the way, Luther had no intentions to begin with to separate from the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
One of the statements that was made in this new statement that I talked about earlier by these various scholars and leaders is, wait a minute, hold it, we are really unified in what we believe. So there was constantly in all this division a recognition that that wasn't the right thing to be doing. And And so my feeling is, no, it did not create violence. There are lots of other forces taking place, big time forces. One of the last quotations Mark used about the advent of secularization, I would say, and pluralism leading to relativism and secularization, all of that, it seems to me, it is much more behind this notion that we are fighting and battling with one another. Hey, the Protestants know how to fight, though. I mean, it's just, and of course, tragically, it sometimes turned bloody. There's no question.
Yeah, that was going to be kind of what I was going to suggest, is that even though we have these things called wars of religion, it would be hard to kind of attribute them just to religion, because there's all kinds of political factors, so is religion causing it, or is it religion's place in society and politics and all of that?
Well, as Winston Churchill, who Prime Minister during a time of great conflict, once said, "This is not the end. It's not the beginning of the end, but it is the end of the beginning." and that's where we are tonight. So this is a marvelous way.
Let us thank the Eatons.